Hi, my name is Lee Carter, and this is the roundtable for the month of May. We are discussing our verse of focus this month has been Psalm 51, verse 10. Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me. David asking God to create in him a clean heart reveals that it's only God who can clean our hearts. No amount of human determination or willpower can create a clean heart. And yet we are part of the process as well. While it's God's nature and not my own that can clean my dirty heart, he won't force his cleansing upon me, and he will not force me into submission to him. I have to come willingly, understanding that I am broken. And once I'm cleansed, then I must be active in the upkeep of my heart. The parable of the evil spirit who left the man he was living in to go find other accommodations is one that has always resonated with me. We know the story. I used it in my article this month because it's one that I really like. And the man gets his house in order in the demon's absence, but he never fills himself up with anything else. And so, of course, when the demon returns, he finds the house clean and vacant. And he brings his friends, and the man is worse off than he had been before. And we can be like this man. When we come to God, we all make changes in our lives. Some of us make changes that are obvious to everybody around us. We change jobs, and our friends and habits become something different than they were before. But some of us change in more subtle ways. Our lives may have been fairly orderly, but we change how we use our resources or our time, and the inner workings of our hearts have to change. That's the transformation. However, if we think we can change once and be done, then we have underestimated, I believe, the cost of this calling. Once our hearts have been cleaned, once our houses are in order, then we have to begin filling ourselves up with God, with his righteousness, his commandments, the work of his kingdom, his wisdom, his understanding, his hope. And we know that then the fruit that we bear are those fruits of the Spirit: love and joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. As we fill ourselves up with those, and the contents of our hearts come forth in our life. We don't want to be found vacant. And in the truest sense, I suppose, we really aren't vacant. The man who cleans his house doesn't stay vacant for long. We all fill ourselves up with something. Every person on the planet does that. So the thing that we've discussed this month in the articles, and that we'll be discussing today, is how do we protect then the conditions of our hearts, keeping them clean and ready to receive God's truth, and to fill ourselves up with him, and not the very demanding world around us that would infiltrate our hearts and find us lacking in the end. So Randy, we're gonna talk to Randy first. So the question that I posed to you was, we know that when we look at the Israelites and their history, we have example after example of what happens when we try to fill ourselves up with the world. Dissatisfied with what God had provided them in the wilderness, they grow impatient, and they not only want to return to their bondage in Egypt, but they even coerce Aaron into building a golden calf for them to worship, even after walking through the Red Sea on dry ground and being fed with food from heaven. It's through the leadership of Moses and Joshua that the nation does finally make it into the land of promise. And we know that God then gives them victory upon victory and hands other nations to them. But from the beginning, we see that they have the desire to be like the nations around them. Their hearts are filled up with themselves. They're not filled up with God. And in fact, by the time Malachi prophesies, after the as the remnant is returning from Babylonian captivity. Malachi warns the nation that their offerings are contemptuous. They wouldn't offer to their earthly rulers what they are offering to God. They don't recognize God's love and care for them. And God says that he's weary of their arrogance and their defilement of his worship. The idea that defilement comes from within is dealt with again by Jesus in Matthew 15, where he says, but the words you speak come from the heart, and that's what defiles you. For from the heart comes evil thoughts, murder, adultery, all sexual immorality, theft, lying, and slander. And so that's what's in the heart, I suppose, without the cleansing, without the righteousness. And I just think, how do we similarly defile ourselves and show contempt for God when we try to merge our culture or our own ideas, our own opinions with our commitment to God? When we hold our jobs, our school activities, even our own wisdom and understanding in higher esteem than we do our worship to God, and how can we avoid those pitfalls of filling ourselves up with the world?
Yeah, I really liked the question. I have a little bit of an echo.
Good.
Can you hear it? I'm sorry. I really liked this question. I think it's super timely. I've recently enrolled in a collaborations class to keep my teaching cert going. And the first assignment that we had to do was this identity thing. We had to tell everybody who we were by finding 5 different aspects of our personality. At least 5 was the minimum. So I'm sure you can imagine, like, I'm sure you could have guessed my 5, and I did like bare minimum, right? Like I'm faith-centered, I'm family-centered, like all the typical, mommy things to do. But what I thought was really interesting was we then had to look at everybody else's presentations, and I found it fascinating the way people represent themselves and how people identify. One woman even had like 12 slides, and she had like videos and audios, like very fancy, apart from the fact that I'm one of the oldest people in the class. It was very fancy and impressive. And that's not me being critical. I just think it's really interesting. And it made me really think about the way we identify. And the US has taken this to a little bit of an extreme, and I don't want to dive into that by any means. But I think there's 2 things really, like you talked about. We have some things that we can't change about ourselves, like where we're born and our cultures. I mean, we can work really hard to get a US passport. Like our kids were born Ethiopian and now they're US, but it was a lot of work. There are some things you can change, but they're like your gender, you're born into what you are. You're born into a body with abilities and disabilities and limitations. When I was 8, I prayed and prayed and prayed so hard for months that God would make me a mermaid. And I'm still not a mermaid. Like, shocker, I'm not. So if I were to jump into the ocean and swim away and start singing into the ocean, I would die, right? We have limitations. And I think most of us understand that and accept those limitations. Our society also puts stuff on us. I promise I'm getting to my point, but I've really been thinking about this. Dan and I talk a lot about how we identify as parents, because Dan does not identify as an adoptive parent, but I really do feel like it's a part of the way I identify as a parent. And I think the difference is because mothers talk to each other about their birth story. It's how we bond, and we talk to each other about physical traits in our children. And I think it has more of a place for mothers instead of fathers. Even now, like raising my daughter, she's starting to grow up, and I'm trying to help her learn how to take care of herself, and stuff like hair and skin, we're learning together, that kind of thing. So I say all of that to say, like, our roles in the same situation can still form, we can still see ourselves in really different ways. And while there are physical definitions and limitations, identity ultimately is a choice that we make. We choose to identify however way we want, right? There are aspects that we choose to focus on and invest in. That's where we identify. We identify with what we find important about ourselves. It's what we find important. So Dan not identifying as an adoptive parent doesn't mean that he's not an adoptive parent. It's just not a part of his identity, I guess, to be really super with it in the lingo. But I know I read this passage a lot. In 1 Peter 2, 9 through 10, Peter says, "You are a chosen race. You're a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his own possession, that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who have called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. Once you were not a people, but now you are God's people. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy." As Christians, we're told what our identity is. We're told. And later on, well, back in chapter 1, verse 15, it says it is our focus and our investment in this identity that allow us to be holy in our conduct. Holy in our conduct is what I'm focused on there in chapter 1, verse 15. Further on down in the chapter, in verse 22 of chapter 1, having purified your souls by your obedience to the truth for a sincere brotherly love, love one another earnestly from a pure heart, since you have been born again, not of perishable seed, but imperishable. I have someone in the back seat, sorry. Through a living and abiding word of God. I don't know if you can hear him laughing, sorry. He's back there giggling. So the Israelites that Aunt Lee mentioned earlier in your question were given an identity. They were told, like, you are God's people. You are the beneficiaries of the promises that were made to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, but they'd been living in Egypt for hundreds and hundreds of years. I mean, this is exactly what you were saying. They didn't look like Israelites anymore. They looked like Egyptians. And so when they were left alone in the wilderness with no guidance whatsoever, they worshiped God the way Egyptians would have worshiped their gods. They knew who they were. They passed down their promises, but they didn't really remember who they were. And they let the Egyptians define them. They let the Egyptians tell them who they were. It is easy to let other things in our lives take priority because they feel pressing or urgent. I think sometimes one reason why I like this question is because it's good timing for me. But I'll say like, oh, I should read my Bible, but I have this huge test tomorrow, or I really should be praying, but the kids need baths and I cannot think when they're in the bathtub, or I really should be singing hymns right now, but it's been a really rough day. I really could use something with a beat that makes me just want to wiggle a little or whatever. But if we do that, there's nothing wrong with it, but we're in danger of losing ourselves. It's not any of this is bad, but if we don't cling to God, we could lose sight of what's important. We could lose our peace. We could lose our hope and ultimately lose our faith. If we look at what Jesus says to Martha about her sister's priorities in Luke 10, he says, "Martha, Martha, you're anxious and troubled about many things, but one thing is necessary. Mary has chosen the good portion, which will not be taken away from her." If we're choosing to make our faith and our Christianity our identity, then we need to act like it. We need to be looking for any and every opportunity to be with him in prayer, to be reading his word, to be with other Christians, to be talking about spiritual things. We need to be careful about our priorities. I think it's funny, we say it a lot. We say, oh, well, I'm a Christian first, and then I'm a mom, or I'm a Christian first, and then I'm a wife, or whatever. You can say anything, but other aspects about our life can creep in. I think a better way to think about it is to say, I'm a Christian, period. I'm a Christian who finds that I'm a woman. So what does a woman Christian do? I'm a Christian and I'm a mom. So what does what does a Christian do as a mother? What does a Christian do as a CEO or a high school student or an American or a German or a Peruvian or or a mermaid? Like, what if you are a Christian, what do you do in the position that we're given? And I do think there's a difference. It may not, it seems subtle, but it's a huge difference, because our priority is Christ. It's not Jesus and then all these other things. Our priority is Christ. And because our priority is Jesus, because it is our faith and our being rooted to God, that is what motivates everything that we do. It motivates us to be good mothers and good wives and good sisters and good stewards and good servants and daughters. It's everything. And our aspects of life are always changing. Today, I'm a mother of 2 10-year-olds. I have 7 more months of that, and then that's gone. And I will never be a mother of 2 10-year-olds again. So this being rooted in our faith and filling ourselves with God, it gives us everything that we need to do to make changes. If we have chosen our identity to be Christians, period, then whatever situation we find ourselves in, we know who we are and how to navigate it.
Oh, I think you're so very right. And it is timely. Because really what the world wants to do is strip that identity away from us. I mean, in essence, what we've done, I mean, I work with teenagers all day, every day. And in essence, what we've done is we've even stripped the most basic pieces of their identity away from them and said, now this is another decision, when you're trying to figure out all these other things. Now this is another decision you're going to make. But I like the idea, like you were saying, just decide that you're a Christian. And then what that does is it provides the stability to navigate the rest of your life. And you're right, you transition. And so if your identity if my identity is my job, then what happens in a couple of years when I retire? Or yeah, if your identity is that you're a mother when your children are grown and gone, I think a lot of women struggle with that because that's been your identity. And so, yeah, no, absolutely. When you were talking, I wrote down, when you were saying, they had forgotten who they were. So when I was in high school and even into college, when I was at home, every time I left the house, Daddy would say to me, remember who you are. I don't know if he said that to Elizabeth. She didn't forget who she was like I did. I had a tendency to. So there maybe there's that. But that idea, and I knew what he meant. It wasn't that I was his child or American or anything, that I was a Christian by identity. And then that makes those other decisions for us. Absolutely. And when you were talking about being an adoptive parent and sharing birth stories with other people, I've said it before, I'll say it again. I dare anybody to trade war stories with you about having kids living in Ethiopia for 6 months. So
it's not comparative, it's just a way that we connect. So that's all I was saying.
I know. I was just saying, no, I didn't think you were making it a contest. I was just saying it is, yeah, and we all have our story. We all have our story. So thank you. So thinking about that idea that our identity and that's then allows us to have the heart that we are supposed to have. And also thinking about the fact that, I mean, you're right, the Israelites had forgotten who they were and they had been influenced by the nations around them. The remnant was the same way. They're coming back and they've been influenced by the cultures that they've been a part of. And although culture is always an issue for any person in any time, and we know that people can be raised in any culture and know who they are because Daniel knows who he is and Esther knows who she is, but the heart of man by its very nature is unclean, which is the problem. And Jillian, that brings us to the question, so that our thoughts and actions and desires and selfish leanings are unclean, and that's who we are. Solomon in Proverbs 20, verse 9 says, who can say, I have made my heart clean? I am free from sin. When none of us can. I mean, when we are forced to confront our own sinful natures, it should move us to transformation, to gratitude for God's grace, to empathy for others should be part of that, and ultimately to humility. However, here's what I wanted to think about with you, Jillian, is there a part, is there a point in which we can be in danger of getting stuck in our sins? In her article this month, Sheila Reeves talked about the fact that we have to let our past mistakes stay in the past. And we've talked about this a little bit before in other roundtables, in other connection to other contexts, but we can't beat ourselves up over the wrongs that we've done. And I think this can be especially difficult when we're living with constant consequences for a sin. Some sins have long-lasting ramifications in our lives. And we see David in Psalm 51 and in other Psalms mourning his own sins, but he's able to move on once the punishment has been delivered. How do we balance being brokenhearted and contrite and humble, which we understand we have to be? How do we balance that with getting stuck in our grief over our sins? Can there be a point where being brokenhearted becomes sinful? How do we produce the fruits of the Spirit, those markers of a heart that has God, if we're in a constant state of mourning over our sinful condition? And can that be can it become just another way that we end up focusing on ourselves?
So one, thank you for this question. I actually think this is a great question because I think it is something that we don't think about a lot. So yes, I do think there's a point where we're in danger of just getting stuck, just like ruminating in our sins. Like, again, I picture this just like that pig rolling around in the mud. And again, I love that you asked this question, as I really do think this can be a place that people, myself included, end up thinking that's how we should act to prove to ourselves and others and God that we have repented. But it's putting our focus in the completely wrong place. We see the answer in the difference between David's verses and Solomon's verses that you mentioned. David asked God to create in him a clean heart, whereas Solomon asked, who can say, I have made my heart clean? So as tempting as it is to allow ourselves to wallow in our transgressions, we have to have faith that if we've repented and asked God for forgiveness, that God has cleansed our heart. Wallowing puts the focus on us rather than on what God has done for us. And in order to serve God with a joyful heart, we have to accept that forgiveness, which is hard. Accept that forgiveness from him and also forgive ourselves. As we see in Proverbs 17:22, a joyful heart is good medicine, but a crushed spirit dries up the bones. It does no one any good to continue to beat yourself up over it. It robs you of one of God's biggest blessings here on this earth, that peace that passeth understanding. So then I got to thinking just about all the people in the Bible that had passed and what it would have been like if they had just wallowed in it and sat there and not gotten past it. So again, I imagine Paul felt horrible about his past, but he didn't seem to dwell there. He took that and he used that to become a better worker of God. He would have never been able to accomplish all that he did for the Lord if he had. Paul talks a lot about this in Galatians 1, if anybody wants to read further on that. I think too a lot about Peter and how would you move on after denying Christ 3 times after you staunchly said that you would never do that? He could have, and especially he was a very prideful man, I think. And so he could have chosen to wallow in it. But instead, afterwards, we see, I think, a more humble Peter after that experience. And then you see him again, then still working with fervor for the Lord. And then there's also James, Jesus's own brother, who, as far as we know, didn't believe in him before his death and literally thought him mad, it says in Mark 3:21, who then became a strong worker in the first century church. And then again, most likely authored the book of James. The guilt from his doubt of his earlier years could have eaten him alive. But as far as we know, he didn't let it. So I feel like there are so many examples in the Bible of people that could have just wallowed in these previous transgressions, but they didn't. They trusted in the Lord with all of their heart and leaned on him. And I think we need to do that as well. As Sheila stated in her article, if you've asked him to cleanse your heart, he has. Don't stay there. So those are my 2 cents on that.
Oh. I mean, there we go. Absolutely. No, and I think that's where faith then really engages, right? That we also believe those promises. And sometimes those are hard to believe. I mean, I think about some of the things I've done and I just think, how could I possibly be forgiven for that? And so then our faith takes over and reminds us that God's nature is not like ours.
Yeah. And again, I think that's where you have to, as Liz would always tell us, it's not about you. And so that's where you've got to focus.
Not about you. That's right.
Shift the focus away from yourself. And yes, we are all sinful,
right?
Horrible. We do not have that clean heart. And so unless God has given it to us. And so anyway, I just think it's putting the focus where it does not need to be. And like you said, I do think it is sinful. And I do think people can get stuck there. And then
I think we can use it as an excuse then not to move forward. Yeah. I've just done something so bad that I'll never be forgiven for it. And so I'm just gonna quit trying. And that's
mainly
really
because I think people feel like, I think the idea of forgiving yourself for it and accepting that forgiveness from God is really hard. Like, right. So yes, God has given it to you, but accepting that he's given it to you is hard. Yeah. So, and then they get stuck.
I do think that's what Paul's talking about when he talks about that he lays everything in his past behind him. It's the good things in his past. It's the bad things in his past. It's all of it. And you just have to keep moving forward. Keep running the race. Keep your eyes on the finish line and just keep running the race. Yep. You fall, you trip, you get up.
We're all going to do it. Yep.
Yeah, yep. Absolutely. Thank you. And that, Amy, I've kind of left you, I think, with a hard one in that, that really, so for me, our lives bear witness to the condition of our hearts. And both Randy and Jillian addressed that idea that you can say you're whoever you want to say you are. But if you want to know, I just gave a baccalaureate speech on Sunday, and one of my main points was if you want to know who somebody is, you don't have to listen to their words, you just watch them. Because we can tell who people are. It's not brain surgery, but people will then also know who we are. And that's something for us to think about, and that it's our actions that tell how our hearts work. And in talking to young people, or new Christians, people who are young in the kingdom, I always worry that we focus so much on outward behavior that we never address the issue of where the behavior comes from. I mean, no Christian mother wants her child participating in immoral activities. However, I think we can get so focused on the activity that we don't address the origin of all the thoughts and actions. It's that motivation of the heart. I don't remember a teenage class when I was growing up that didn't talk about dating and modesty and social drinking. And all of those are relevant topics to the teenage years. But I feel like there's a danger that we beat that dead horse and miss the issue of the heart. And so when I was looking at Cheryl's article this month, Cheryl Robertson's article talking about fighting spiritual heart disease, and it made me think about the fact that if we thought our child was physically ill, most of us would take them to a doctor. Even if the symptoms were not visible to us, if they acted in such a way that we thought something internal was going on, there isn't a stone that we would leave unturned to solve this problem, this medical problem. But spiritually, unless our children are overtly misbehaving, we have a tendency to ignore spiritual heart disease. Maybe I say that and I'm just thinking of myself as a mother. I don't know, but it feels that way, that we excuse a lot of things that I think are danger signs for us sometimes. You know, Proverbs 17:22 says, a joyful heart is good medicine, but a crushed spirit dries up the bones. And so the question is really, what symptoms do we watch for in our children's actions and words and lives? And how do we address those issues without provoking our children to wrath or drying up the bones?
Yeah, this one was a rough one, especially for a mother of a teenager. So, but as I was thinking through this,
Sorry.
it's good. It's a good thing for me to continue to think about. One of the things I was in a parenting, I think, conference. This has been a couple of years back, and it was on addressing the heart. And one of the things that he brought up that really, really stuck with me was I could try to create, let's just say in my garden, I have a dead rose bush, but I go get fake roses from Michael's and I stick them all in my rose bush and I make it seem, look at how beautiful it is. And he said, parents tend to act this way. It's like we want to make a fake bush out there for everybody to see with our child, but really they're dead because there's no spiritual backing behind it. And if I'm honest, even the personality of your child could play a part in this. I was a people pleaser. I did the right things. That does not mean my heart was right. In fact, in many ways, my heart was probably dying inside, but I looked really good. I was the Pharisee, right? That had a clean outside and the inside was rotting away. And that can happen with our children if we're not careful. And quite frankly, you could have somebody that looks a little bit dirty on the outside, but they're thinking very deep thoughts. They're struggling with big questions. And we're picking at the symptoms when really they are trying to make a change inside. So I think we have to be very careful because, again, all of these verses about judging, we should also take those to heart with our own children, right? Be careful how you judge. I don't have the same personality as my two children, and I have to be thoughtful about how I'm addressing them and working with them. So I wanted to point that out first. But, the other big thing that you said in this was if your child was showing symptoms, you would take them to the doctor. So I'm going to tell you something. If my child has a headache, maybe I can give them an Advil, but I'm not a doctor. I'm not a physical doctor. And for me then to say, you know what, I'm going to try some surgery on my child, that's just the dumbest thing that would ever happen. And quite frankly, even if I was a doctor, I might not be the right person to do it because I'm so invested in it. There is a physician for this, and that's Jesus. And I think one of our problems is that we can work, if we think we're going to fix the problem. We're not going to fix the problem, right? Just like our parents couldn't fix the problem for us. They could do other things, and I'll get to those, but you have to be taken to the great physician, right? That's what we ultimately have to do. So as I was thinking about just practical tips about what we can do, is the very first thing that I think is critical is we have to project an example ourselves. So we have to really be thoughtful about, am I putting God first, right? Is my heart cleansed? Am I projecting what a clean heart, right? That God has put in me, a clean heart. And I'm going to give a couple really practical tips on this. Our kids now are living in an era that they have more access to. I think Satan is enjoying all the access they have at their fingertips. And, I actually feel kind of sorry for this generation because it also means a lot of their mistakes are getting just blasted across the world out for everybody to see. And they're going to have to go live with that years later, which really stinks, right, for them. But I think the verse in Psalms 101:3, it's important, right? And what it says is, I won't put anything worthless in front of my eyes. And I'll tell you what, that's convicting, very convicting to me every day. What are my kids actually seeing me interact with on a day-to-day basis? Is it the Bible? Is it spiritual things? Or am I sitting on my phone, scrolling through trash, worthless things, right? Am I even spending, right? I think Randy mentioned this. These could be good things actually, but you're not prioritizing the best thing, right, above it. And so what am I showing? What am I projecting as an example? The second thing is prayer. I can't emphasize prayer enough, that we have to be going to the Lord saying, please, please, right? Put in my children a new heart. Help them, right? Help them to see what is most important. So interceding in prayer for them. And you see that example in Job, which I think is an amazing example when he even sacrifices, saying, just in case they're doing something. And then the last part I would say is this little bit more interactive piece with your child, but I would also say we have to be careful. So as a mom, I mean, I read all of the passages about being a dripping faucet, right? A nag. I worry sometimes that we can start to nag, right? We can nag our kids to death, like, don't do that, don't remember this, right? And they're just, it's building up in them anger. So I think sometimes it's more just a prompt. You ask a question, and maybe you let them stew on the question, right? Like, was that the right thing to do? Do you think? And maybe you leave it at that, right? You just let that, and perhaps you circle back to it later. Like, have you had any chances to think on that? But I think, to me, it's even constantly trying to turn them back to, it's not so much about the behavior. It's about what's underlying that behavior. So a great example in my house, like, I mean, remember I told you what kind of kid I was, but grades were hugely important to me. To my kids, they're just not important. They could care less. But one of the conversations we do have about, because the Lord gave me these kids for a reason, and it's made me chill out, and that's a good thing. But I will say, is it your best? Because what I'm really concerned about is, are you actually performing are you doing the best you can? And if that's the best you can, let's let it go, right? Let's move on. It doesn't matter. But if it's not, why? Can you tell me why? Why isn't it your right? Why don't you feel like you should have to give it your best? You know, is there some other priority that you think is bigger than doing your best for your teacher or doing your best? I mean, so it's even having those kinds of conversations. And again, please don't take me to think that I'm judging everybody out there with their kids, because I'm not. But I think for me, it's just a way to start those conversations to say, and it may or may not change their behavior immediately, but it is a way for us to start having these biblical discussions. The other thing, and I think we brought this up before, is be careful that if your child is actually coming to you, this is what other thing I'll say as a parent of a teenager, and I really worry about it as my youngest one gets, because I'll be really old by then, but they're never going to want to talk to you at a convenient time. Like, right, they're going to come to you when you are exhausted or in the middle of something. Drop whatever you're doing and go talk to them and listen to them, because it's few and far between. And we have to make room for that, for them to come to us. And the other thing is, if they tell you something that you don't agree with, don't freak out right away. Don't just lose your mind. Stay calm, have that discussion with them and say, okay, that's interesting. Tell me why you think that, right? I mean, prompt some of those things, because I think sometimes we make mistakes as parents and we forget we are 20, 30 years, potentially 40 years down the road from them in maturity, right? They are much more immature in their understanding. They live in a different cultural surrounding, quite frankly, than we did when we were in high school or middle school. And so I think those are just important things to remember. And I know those are practical tips, but I want to leave us with this verse in Jeremiah. He says in verses 9 and 10, the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately sick. Who can understand it? I, the Lord, search the heart and test the mind, to give every man according to his ways and according to the fruit of his deeds. And I think it's so important for us to just remind our kids, your heart will deceive you. Don't buy into this follow your heart nonsense. Don't do that. Your heart is deceitful. And we need to point them back to the Lord and say, he will test the heart. He will give you, as Ezekiel says, a new heart. And he's the one we have to continue to point them back to in our example, in prayer, and then through these promptings. So that's my 2 cents.
Oh, thanks, Amy. That was really good. And I think you're right. I really do think your kids know you. Your children know you, and they know you better than anybody else. And if there's anybody who knows when your words and actions don't match, it's your kids. And you're right. I mean, we are not the physician in this, and the only doctor we can take them to is Jesus, and just prayer. I mean, I talk to there are a lot of young women in one of the Bible classes that I'm involved with, and I tell them all the time, it's not too early to be praying about who your child will marry, I mean, you pray for those things. I prayed because John was getting because my husband's not a Christian, he was getting, the world's message in his home as well. And I prayed that there would be people who would influence him the other direction, that, and my whole family moved to Germany about that time. So there, I think we can look at examples in our own lives, and those of us who have grown children now can probably look back and see those answered prayers, some unanswered prayers, things I prayed for that didn't happen. And now I can see that was the best thing, that I didn't know what was right. But absolutely our example and prayers, I really do think that's it. And I think we can extend this past our children, even to new Christians, the conversations that we have with them, that we expect them to change in all ways immediately. And that's just not the way it works. They are growing just like our kids. They're still babes in Christ, and we have to keep our patience and keep our wits about us. That's right. And not freak out at the first sign of, whoa. So, when you talked about social media, I totally agree with you. I have said so many times, I am so grateful on so many levels that we did not have anything like that when I was a teenager, for me to blast my idiocy to the world and have it recorded somewhere. I'm so grateful. I did enough damage just on the little platform that I had. I cannot even imagine. But all right, Elizabeth, we'll end up with you, and I'm coming back to the idea of a couple of the parables. I had a hard time making these two ideas meet. So I'm glad that when we talked, you said that you kind of had worked them together and we're headed that direction anyway. It's good when you think alike. But the man who never fills his life up with anything good, if we're like him and we can't manage to detach ourselves from the world, we can find ourselves worse off than we were before we knew God. And of course, we know in 2 Peter 2:22, we see that those who don't maintain cleanliness are worse off than they were prior. And Mark says that the one who betrays Christ would have been better off never having been born. 1 Corinthians tells us to be careful when we think we're standing, that we're apt to fall. And so obviously our cleansing is an action of God, but in ways, isn't it a continual process? David prays for cleansing and renewal. And so one of my questions was, do you think those are the same thing, or is one predicated on the other? And how are those ideas connected for us? And what's our part in this? I don't think it's a passive thing. What action is required? And then the other thing that I kept thinking about was the parable of the sower, and those various conditions of the human heart. And that once a heart comes into contact with the word, the reaction varies from individual to individual. And I was focused mostly on that rocky ground that Jesus mentioned, the soil that's not cleaned out. It's full of brambles and weeds and thorns from earlier plantings, or from natural soil conditions. Maybe it's just the environment, the culture that we've been talking about. Can the rocky ground become good soil? We all know people who try to remove themselves from their past lives only to be pulled back in. And so that cleansing process, the continuation of it, and the endurance and the perseverance that it takes, what does that look like? And is it something that we just do every day?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. And I will say that the parable of the sower, which we'll talk about a little bit, but I just off the top of the conversation, I would say absolutely yes, that the seed falls on the different soils, and the different soils have obstacles. They have things that they have to overcome. Certainly there's some good soil that is prepared ahead of time and ready for the reception and the roots to grow deeply. But there is, I believe, in Jesus's message, a warning and a hope for all the soil, that he warns even those whose hearts are already hardened, that they could soften their hearts, that there are ways to prepare your heart. And then for those who receive, and there is a warning that there has to be some availability for depth to grow, that if it's shallow, it's easier for it to be wiped away. And so I think what Jesus is doing is he's warning those who will be his new disciples to prepare and to be ready to do the work. While David prays for God to create a clean heart for him in Psalms 51, which you've already alluded to, he then continues with the thoughts that when you do this, and everybody's made the point that it is God who creates that clean heart, that David said, then I will teach the transgressors your ways. When you cleanse me, when you free me, when that liberty comes through you, when that forgiveness is given, when your word saturates me, what that will do for me is it will lead me to act. Then I will teach others of your ways so that sinners will turn back from you. Deliver me, and then my tongue will sing of your righteousness. That there's no question that God does the cleansing. He does the forgiving. He does the fertilizing. He is the one that creates for us that clean heart. The cleansing of the heart, that deliverance from the filth to clean, those are gifts from God. And that should bring then the worshiper, the receiver, to activity. And there's no question that the parables that you talked about speak to that. The man who, you've talked about, who makes sure his house is cleaned, and he gets the cobwebs out, and he gets those spirits out of there and all. Then there's activity that he must do in order to provide that house good, clean, enriching things that will ward off something else entering it. And David knew that if God supplied the cleansing, that he would then supply the praise. And I think praise consists of a lot of things. It would change the activities of his life. He would be one who would spend his days showing others, singing God's perpetual praises, and not returning then to that heart that had that filth in it that had just been taken away. And there's no question that we see this in other passages as well. And so the focus on the parable, as you mentioned, is that the heart being examined is shown in 4 different types of hearts or soils, the parable of the sower that you mentioned. And so 4 hearts in the world receive the word. The first one is so hardened that the word doesn't penetrate. So 3 out of 4 of the hearts receive the word initially, receive the good news, receive the knowledge of the cleansing, receive the gifts of grace and salvation. 2 out of 3 will be lost, and the soil will have events and circumstances embedded or surrounding the new roots and new stems that the word has allowed, and will be overtaken. The reality of the world is harsh, and it's overcoming, and it requires continual activity on the part of the one who has been cleansed, or the one who receives the continual cleansing that God gives through the forgiveness. Hebrews 12, I think, describes, and Lee, you alluded to this passage, but this is the first passage that my mind went to, in that Hebrews 12, beginning of Hebrews 12, after he's given us a reminder of those who have pursued in faith that salvation through their activities, that faith led to an obedience. And he says, therefore we also, since we are surrounded by such great clouds of witnesses, since we are reminded of what it is that God has done, let us lay aside every weight. I think that's the removal of those stones, and the removal of the thorns, and the fertilization of the soil, and the sin that so easily ensnares us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. So rather than a garden growing, it's the race that's run. But it's the same thought, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. And so we, in this latter dispensation are able to see even though the one who did so well to finish the race, who set those weights aside. And we see that his struggle in the garden and in the wilderness, and we see him as he sets himself apart after the feeding of the 5,000, and he has set off those weights. He has worked hard and has finished that race. And we see that. And there are stones and weeds and interruptions in all soil. And when one comes to Christ, they come with soil that's been muddled with the world. Certainly different stages. But even as Amy alluded, even those of us who grow up hearing and we come to Christ with less entanglements within our soil, we at some point face those thorns and those weeds and those stones and those weights. Some come with much cleansing needed initially. All will be forgiven, forgotten by the Father, but the heart must work out the salvation. It is our labor. Philippians 2 says, therefore, my brethren, since you realize what Christ has done for you, as you also have obeyed, not in my presence only, not just when Paul was there, but now much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God who works in you both to will and to do for his good pleasure. And so we see that while God has allowed that salvation, that there is work that is being done by God continually. He is working that out as we are working it out as well. You know, it's an interesting work, this continual cleansing of our gardens and our soil, the removal of the weight so that we can run. Taking off those weights can be continuously done. And it can be weights that we realize that have come on quickly or that have existed for years, that we might not be choked out, that we might not be too weary to run by weights that have either been there for a long time and we've not realized it. And as we begin to labor and to serve, we have to examine ourselves in the light of our own salvation. It's interesting because sometimes what we do is we consider and examine our works in the light of others. And we think that we're running so much quicker and so much faster, or that we're blooming and our fruit is so much stronger, so much greater than someone around us. And we actually have no idea how many stones and thorns and weights another has taken care of on one particular day. And if we're busy clearing our own soil and making sure that our fruit is full and healthy, and we are producing and we are remaining clean, then our motives lend us to help others to remove the stones and the thorns and the weights that they struggle with, in order that we all may remain pure and clean. And so I do think it's interesting. I think that all of us struggle with this. You know, Amy mentioned that she looked a certain way, but, and I love the analogy. You can put on these false blooms, but the bush has to be alive in order that it can continue to bloom and to bear the fruit that God has intended for it to do. And that's true for us too. We need to be fertilizing, we need to be weeding, we need to be tossing the stones out, and we need to be continually helping others to do the same thing. And everybody knows that if you leave soil unattended, even that pure soil, by the way, which is described in that parable, can become embedded with the corruption and unwanted obstacles. And it becomes imperative then that we're able to identify what's evil and what is good. You know, we've talked about that throughout our studies within this paper, that part of our job, part of our work, part of our activity is to be able to cling to what God has given us that purifies our soil, that fertilizer, which helps us grow, for months and months. Earlier, last fall, I tried to get rid of this huge root system within my garden. And stubbornly, I would dig and I would pull and at these underlying roots. But once the colder months, I live in Florida, so the colder months set in, I didn't really work in the garden much, and I didn't bother over the course of the cooler months to work on that root system, only to find out when the spring months came and I began to work in my garden again, that out of my ignorance, persistence, God allowed, or the natural processes allowed those those roots to grow. And it was actually a hibiscus bush that I was trying to get rid of. And not seeing the good, I tried to remove the core of what would bring the bloom. And we need to be able to identify at the same time the weeds and the things that will do damage. I've also allowed weeds to grow, thinking that in Florida, this must be a natural thing that just grows, and it was beautiful. But I found out later that it was a weed that would actually kill the things around it. And so I think that one of the things that's so important for us to understand as we examine clean hearts is that we, as the gardeners of our own gardens, as the runners of our own race, must be able to identify properly the weights that ensnare us and tangle us up, the root systems that are good, things that are good for us that we might see as something negative, which may bring forth good fruit. We have to be able to identify in ourselves the things that are going to be able to allow us to remain pure, to bear good fruit, and to run the race. And so we have to be able not just to understand that God's cleansing us, but to remove anything that is impure, that allows for impurities, and anything that could even be painful to remain, so that we grow and we bear that proper fruit. And the weights and the thorns aren't always outward. Amy touched on that. It's not always outward. The fruit can be there and the bush can be dead if we're not careful. They're not always outward. It's not always drinking and anger and sexual impurities, which sometimes adult new converts come and have to remove those stones. And those are the big stones. And we see them chunking those things out of the garden. But sometimes these weights can consist of pride and impatience and sowing discord and self-righteousness. And we have to be careful. A lying tongue, a gossiping tongue. Our soil, our gardens, our race are all successful only in God. But we must work to fertilize, to remove the obstacles, to keep our beds, our efforts, our fruit pure and righteous. We then accept the clean soil that God's provided. We accept the training and the tools that Christ, the author and the finisher of the faith, have given to us. And we work, and we get busy, and we help ourselves, and we remove all the interruptions and the interferences. And we cling to that cleanness given by God. And I would just say that we all should say thank you to God for allowing us the liberty from sin while we work to remove our own obstacles and provide the work that's needed for the cleansing.
I think that's, yeah, absolutely. And when you were talking, and Randy mentioned this too, that every life has obstacles. I mean, we all have things in our way, and that we need to be cleansed of. That idea that we would have physical deficiencies or emotional deficiencies or instability in our families. We all come with those roots and weeds in our garden, and that we can use them how we're going to, as God cleans, as excuses or as motivations, as God cleans our hearts. And that idea also that then we all clean. I thought about the when you said, we don't compare. Part of the problem is we compare ourselves to others. And then that's a very outward, we don't know what's going on under the surface, like the dead rose bush that has the roses pasted on it. And I thought about the older brother of the prodigal son, that he thought he thought he was right. I've been here the whole time. I've been doing what was right. I've been the one, and really in his very conversation with his father, he reveals that he wasn't right, because his heart was not happy that his brother was home. The humility and the gratitude was not evident in his actions, even though his words may have been right in some ways. His heart obviously was out of whack. That we need to make sure that our gardens are clean, that our hearts are clean, and we have to be part of that process. I had a conversation with somebody not too long ago that said, we were talking about clean hearts, and he said, God's the only one who can clean your heart. And I said, that is true, but I have to be part of the process. It will not be forced on me. The cleansing has to be, God can make things possible that I didn't think were possible in my life, but I have to do the work. And so, I'm sorry.
And that's the thing about Jesus's parables. They were warnings. He didn't want everybody that would have these. He wanted the ones that had thorns and weeds to see that, so
Right.
that they could take care of that. It wasn't that he was saying, "Oh, well, this is just going to be the way it is." Some of you'll receive it, and then this will happen. He
Right.
was saying to all of us, that we need to watch out for what kind of soil we have and what it is that is surrounding that soil.
And begin the purification, the transformation of the soil. Absolutely. And that idea, well, and in the parable, only one of them has a good outcome with the seed. So the rocky ground and the hardened ground, they don't have the shallow ground, they don't have good outcomes. And so we have to take the rocky soil in order to become good soil. We have to start attending. Absolutely. I like the word you use, fertilizing, that idea that we take in the good. We fill ourselves up with good, because if we don't fill ourselves up with good, then the world will take the opportunity to fill us up with what it wants us filled up with. So I hope.
Hey, Lee.
Yeah.
One thing to also think about that I just read in my Bible reading, but I thought it was interesting, is when Jesus washes their feet, right? They have to accept him. So Peter tries to block him, right? Nope, I don't want you to do that, Lord. And then they kind of even have a discussion about that. But I think we have to allow Jesus. I think this was a symbol, right? Of that accepting it, right? No, you have to accept me coming and washing your feet.
Right.
Yeah.
Cleanse me. And then, like we were talking about with Jillian's, then I have to accept that I'm cleansed, and I have to move on and get busy, like Elizabeth was saying, and fill myself up with those good things. And it's only then that I can be an example to my children or other people. And I always let my child see my struggle. I'm not perfect. And I was completely open with that. I am struggling with this today. This is an issue. And so I don't know if that was helpful or if it was a bad plan. I don't know. He turned out okay, so seems to be all right, but so far. But I think that for me as a young person, part of it was I was stubborn and rebellious. And part of it was that I looked at other people and they looked so perfect. And I thought, I won't be that. So I'm just not going to try. And that's bad on me. I'm not blaming other people, but I'm just saying, I think if we need to let our cracks show sometimes. I think it's okay for that to be part of our children's experience and other people. And then we help each other with our, like we've been saying, it's only when we get our own garden cleaned or we're trying to clean that we can help other people tug the rocks out of theirs. And so I think that's something. as well. Thank you so much for, if you've stuck with us through this, thank you so much for being with us today. We lost Randy. She had an appointment with her children and had to sign off a little bit early, but I'm grateful to the other editors and to those of you who are listening. We hope that you're visiting the website, that we've got new articles coming out. Some of the In the Trenches, I think were pushed out again this week and in an email. We're trying to keep up with classes. Some of us are just dog paddling at this point in the year, but we are doing our best, and this has been such a blessing. I think I can speak for all of us in our lives, and we hope that it has been a benefit to you as well. Thanks again for joining us.